All right, good morning, everybody. Let me back up. We're thankful for your presence here. It is a beautiful Sunday morning. We are going to continue our study that we've been considering in our little 20-minute class on Sunday morning, looking at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so we've already focused on Galilee, and that is to say the ministry of Jesus, and 7 times that he makes reference to the death he's about to endure. We also went back to the Old Testament and we looked at Isaiah chapters 52 and 53 to consider his death from a prophetic standpoint, to see how the things that we're really digging into in real time in Galilee, first century Jerusalem, were particularly noted and discussed in the Old Testament. And then from there we went to Gethsemane, and we took 7 observations from that famous prayer before Jesus goes and endures his suffering, his death, and eventual resurrection. And now we come to the next fateful series of moments. I'll just tell you just what's coming up next week. It's in fact the next 3 weeks, starting next week, is a look at Jesus actually on the cross. We're going to consider, and that's going to be the end of this month and the end of our second part of our 3-part class, looking at the actual death and specifically the things that Jesus says on the cross. Very famously, he has 7 sayings. We're going to really dig into those over the course of the next 3 weeks, starting next week. But in between Gethsemane and Golgotha, in between those prayer observations and those 7 statements, is what we're considering this morning, and that is GABBATHA. He talks about his death at Gethsemane. He prays about his death he talks about it in Galilee. He prays about his death in Gethsemane. He'll endure his death at Golgotha, but he suffers humiliation, beating, torturous agony before Golgotha in a place called GABBATHA. The word GABBATHA only appears 1 time in your Bible, or it may not at all, depending on your translation, but it's in John 19:13, and it means literally it means ridge. But it was used to mean slab, like a flat concrete surface on which all manner of things were done. Laws were enacted, justice was served. In this case, injustice was done. And it was here where Jesus was, to put it in the simplest of terms, roughed up before he was crucified. And we're going to notice from GABBATHA 7 heinous acts that Jesus endured. And I limit it to 7 because we only have 20 minutes, and as I speak, we only have 17 minutes. We could go into so much more detail if we had more time, because he endures a lot more than 7. But just to hit 7 in particular, let's notice some things my Lord suffers. First of all, leading up to GABBATHA itself is agonizing, because as we left Gethsemane last week, Jesus, or the last time we were in Gethsemane, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, Jesus was praying, and we noticed his final moment, which was a special persistence. Despite all the mental agony he was going through in his prayer, he got up. It famously says he stood up and went to endure his betrayal. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a betrayal. Judas going with a band of Jewish leadership cohorts and the temple guard to come and claim him, arrest him, and take him back for his sham of a trial and everything that led to that. We're going to skip right over all of that for lack of time and go straight to when they take him before Pilate, which takes us to Matthew 27. We're going to be most of our study in Matthew 27, so go ahead and open there. I'll reference a little bit from Luke, a little bit from John, once from Isaiah, but we'll keep referring back to Matthew 27. So Jesus has been offered up before Pilate to be killed. Pilate has, in turn, turned around and offered him back to the Jews. Pilate has presented to the Jews this easy choice. Here, on this one hand, you can choose, as is our custom on Passover, to release a prisoner, Jesus, a man who is meek and lowly in heart, or the insurrection-stirring, murderous committing Barabbas. Who will you choose? Do you want me to free into your streets at night the innocent Jesus or this evil Barabbas? Thinking the choice was simple, and they say, no, give us Barabbas. We'll take on ourselves that crime, that sinner, that evil, and we'll put Jesus to death. Not even realizing the irony of taking in themselves the sinner Barabbas, thus allowing themselves to put to death the one who would save them from the crime of putting Jesus to death. So they said, no, let Jesus die. And that takes us to the first thing Jesus suffered. Matthew 27:26. They, number one, scourged him. Now, without getting too graphic and too detailed, a scourging is a whipping with a Roman flagellum, which is, if you're familiar with, like the cat o' nine tails, which is not just a whip, like Indiana Jones had a whip and it just had one little strip at the end. A cat o' nine tails branches out into multiple strips of leather. And so to be whipped with multiple is to be struck with multiple strips of leather. But the Romans, as you may know, are notorious for their sadism. Remarkably innovative in how they can endure or bring about an endurance of punishment from their victim. They loved conjuring up new ways to make someone suffer. So instead of just striking someone with a whip that had multiple strips at the end, they tied to those strips at the end bits of bone or glass or sharpened rocks, so that they became like nails or claws. Like imagine an eagle's talon, not just one time scraping you, but smacking into your back and digging in those sharpened ends, and then snapping it back so it ripped your back. And then not just once, but twice and 3 times and 4, being struck with these razor sharp talons, ripping your back to pieces. Now people will go to Gethsemane. Scoffers and mockers and belittlers will go to Gethsemane, and they'll see this man weeping and praying in agony. Praying in agony. Has anyone ever prayed in agony? Jesus was in agony while he was praying about what was to come. And they'll say, well, that must be a weak person. Look at this weak person who can't even think about something without breaking down and crying. My master was not a weak person. He got up to face this, knowing it was coming. He stood up from prayer and faced down his betrayer, knowing behind his betrayer was a Roman flagellum. He's not a weak man. In fact, it was common for a Roman to scourge you before crucifying you, and it was common for you to die on the slab before you ever made it to the cross. And even those people weren't weak people, but you had to be remarkably stronger to survive the scourging. First of 7 things my Lord endures. He was scourged. Let's remember, before we move on, why he's doing this. Remember the text we studied last week and the week before that also, of Isaiah 53. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. By his stripes we are healed. To look at the back of my Lord, at least in the early stages of his scourging, was to see a back that was striped red, of flesh and blood, and flesh and blood, and muscle and sinew and blood, until eventually there was no distinction. There was no longer a striping. It was just this back of confetti, a mangling of flesh, blood, and bone. My Lord endured the first thing, a scourging. And by the way, how many people are involved in this? It says in Matthew 27:27, the King James says a band of soldiers. That would have been a garrison. Roman century is 100, Roman legion is 6,000, a Roman garrison is 600. It's a lot of people in the vicinity. A lot of people taking part, either directly or indirectly, in what my Lord's enduring, which leads us right into the second thing he endures. They mocked him. And now imagine all of us, if we had the choice, would you rather be mocked relentlessly by 600 evil people or scourged to the point of death? All of us would choose the mocking. I would rather endure mockery than a scourging. Now imagine if you're scourged without any say and then mocked. You don't get a choice. You get both. And there's still 5 more to go. First, they stripped him. I can think of nothing more humiliating than that right off the bat. They stripped him, and 600 gathered around, mocked him, belittled him, laughed at him in his humiliation. Literal humiliation, a word which comes from the word humble, to be lowered. Humble and lowered. They put him below them and laughed at him. And I doubt as they took the clothes off his back, mind you, he was scourged first and then stripped. Now, if you've ever gotten a cut or something while you're wearing clothes and you don't have time to bandage it, your blood will cause your clothes to stick to your skin. And I imagine they were not gentle in peeling his mangled back from its clothes draped over it. I imagine they very forcefully ripped it off. So whatever chopped up remains of his back was there, it was matted to his his clothing, and then ripped free. So all those wounds that had just started to heal and just started to coagulate, ripped apart all over again, starting the suffering all over again. And so they stripped him and mocked him. Then the King James says plaited, which is a word that means just to twist and contort and mangle into a facsimile of a crown, because he's the king, and we're going to mock his royalty. So we're going to give him a look befitting a king. So rip off his nasty clothes and let's put a crown on his head. Now the King James says they put a crown on his head. The word literally means to impose. You have to impose when someone says no thank you. You have to insist upon it when they don't want it. This crown of thorns was insisted upon his head. It was shoved when a human body would naturally recoil from sewing needle length thorns being pressed onto his skin. There was no recoiling allowed. He was held down and shoved. A crown of thorns befitting this king in their mind. And then a reed was placed, stick placed in his hand. A plain Jane stick placed in his hand, and they called it a scepter. Because he was so insignificant, the king they thought that he claimed to be, that he's not worthy of a real crown, he's not worthy of a real scepter, so they give him this mocking variety. And then they bow a knee. Oh, they bow the knee to Jesus. They bow a blasphemous knee and utter a blasphemous rendition of Hail King of the Jews. Which takes us to the third thing he endured. Verse 30 of Matthew 27. They struck him. They scourged him. They stripped him. And they struck him. First, they struck him with their own spit. They spat upon him. Now, if you know the old law, then you know they have 1,000 different ways for you to become unclean. There was 1,000 ways that you could find yourself suddenly unholy, impure in the eyes of your neighbors. You had to ceremonially cleanse yourself again. To be spat upon is one of those ways. Think about that. Not even me spitting on someone, which is my crime against someone, makes me unclean. No, if you spit on me, I'm innocent. I'm the victim. But you spitting on me makes me unclean. That's Numbers 12, verse 14. And here Jesus has a man hawk up a loogie of his nasty saliva and hurl it into his face. We don't have to be Jews to appreciate the disgust of that. But the additional injustice of that is now he is considered ceremonially unclean for the very people he is spiritually cleansing through enduring all of this. So they spit upon him. The ultimate act of insult and mockery. They spit upon him. And then they strike him again. Luke 22:64 here. They strike him with their hands. They blindfold him, they spin him around, and they slap him on the face, and they say, prophesy, prophesy, tell us who hit you. Imagine viewing this, we are right now. We're reading it, so we're viewing it from a third-party perspective. But imagine actually being able to witness it, peering in through a window and just observing this. If you didn't know who it was, who is this man that is being spit upon and blindfolded and treated like a piñata? If you didn't know who this person was, you didn't know what he had done, even if he was a criminal, you don't know. Just to see it, you think, this is so degrading. This is so dehumanizing. And we're not even halfway done with the list. And I left out a lot more. They strike him. They strike him with their spit. They strike him with their hands. They strike him, Matthew 27:30, with the reed they had put in his hand a little bit ago. They yank it from him, and they smack him on the head. You ever been hit with a big stick on the head? You ever been hit with a baseball bat? My Lord has been. And I'm not just a third party here. I'm not just an innocent bystander. As I read this, I have to remind myself I am a once upon a time guilty bystander. I am now a cleansed and set free from that crime bystander. I have to go back and read this, not because I don't feel guilty anymore. My guilt's been washed away. I'm no longer guilty of this. I was guilty of it. I will always have been guilty of it. But that sin that I took part in, which led to him enduring this, has for me been washed away. But I still have to go back and remind myself that he endured this because of my sins that are washed away. And so it doesn't bring about guilt. What it brings about is a desire never to go through this again. And never to bring to myself the same kind of spiritual shame that my Lord physically endured because of my sins. Does that make sense? I read about this. Even though I've been washed free of the crime of it, I need to remind myself of it so that I don't remind Jesus of what he went through for my sin. They strike him with their hands. They strike him with their spit. They strike him with the reed. There's another one that we don't find in the gospel accounts. And it's Isaiah 50 verse 6. They strike him by ripping the beard from his cheeks. Listen to the prophet. He gave his back to the smiters and his cheeks to them that pluck out his beard. And he did not hide his face from shame and spitting. They grabbed my master's facial hair. I don't have enough to grab. But imagine if you did. Frank's not here. Imagine if you grabbed someone who had a real handful of hair and just ripping it out. Not just tugging it, but grabbing it and forcefully pulling it up that just rips off your face. The sting and the burn and the pain and just the humiliation of it. And that there's not even a symbolicness to that. Spitting on someone, symbolic. I disregard you as a human being. Putting the crown and the reed on his hand, symbolic. You're a mocking version of a king. But just to grab someone's beard and rip it out, that's just blind evil. That's just pure, impulsive action of hatred. And that's what he took. And if you notice, of the ones we've been studying involving Jesus, Galilee, Gethsemane, now here, Jesus talked and talked and talked and talked in Galilee about his death. And he talked and he talked and he talked and he talked to the Lord in Gethsemane. And on Golgotha, as we start it next week, he's going to talk and talk and talk. 7 big statements, 7 important things he wants to say before he dies. But here, the Lord is entirely silent. At the lowest part of his humiliation, at the depths of his human despair, where he is being treated as less than a person, he has nothing to say. Get it out of your system. Do it all, and then I'll go and die for you. Fourth thing he endured, they shamed him. They struck him, they stripped him, they shamed him. Matthew 27:32 through 35, specifically verse 35. After they put him on the cross, they strip him down, and they gamble over his clothing, and they divide amongst themselves the rest of him. Now, the standard Jewish male, the standard clothing attire for a Jewish male is 5 articles of clothing. 4 if you count the sandals as one thing, but separating them is 5. You have a sandal, you have a sandal, you have an inner garment, an outer garment, and you have a girdle, a waist, wrap that wraps around your midsection, holding it all together. So before you're crucified, you're not crucified wearing your clothing. Different depictions, different art, different illustrations paint it differently. But accurately, they take everything off of you. And then the Romans who are in charge of that divide it up amongst themselves, and they take home souvenirs. And if there's any value to it, they perhaps will sell it for themselves. And so one Roman soldier is going to walk away from this scene with the sandal of my Lord. Another's going to walk away with another sandal of my Lord. Another's going to walk away with the inner garment of my Lord. Another's going to walk away with the girdle of my Lord. And then they come to this last piece of clothing, the outer garment, which is seamless. So you cannot just rip it up and divide it amongst the group so that everybody could have an equal part. Now we've got to do something to get our hands on this because we have to finish this last bit of clothing. And so what are we going to do? Well, how about we just gamble over it? Let's cast lots for it. And then whoever wins gets to take home the prize. They have turned my master's death into a carnival game. They have turned the death of an innocent man into sport that they get to gamble over and win prizes for. It's a fall festival at the feet of Jesus while he's dying on the cross. Do you see the humiliation? Do you see the insult and the shame? So you take away my Lord's sandals. You take away my Lord's inner garment. You take away my Lord's girdle. You take away my Lord's outer garment. What is left on my master's body? He is left shamed. He's left stripped and naked, wearing only the blood that is stained on his skin. And then, that's the 5th thing. I already said it. They gambled over him. He's on the cross. He's dying. I'm almost done. And they gamble over him. Hebrews 12 verses 2 and 3 says he looked down from the cross despising the shame, the King James says. I think it's there. You can barely see it. 3rd line from the bottom on our theme. Despising the shame. The word despising just simply means to look down on. But we use that to mean belittle, to insult, But it literally just means to get on a higher vantage point and look down on. So literally my Lord looked down on the shame of sin, because he was up above and below him were people gambling over him. But even metaphorically, he was despising sin because it means to disregard, to think less of. My Lord at Gethsemane prayed, not my will but thy be done. And then he gets up and he goes, knowing he's going to endure something horrible. And he gets up and endures it because he considers enduring it less important than the blessings that come from it. He disregarded all he was going to endure so that I could be redeemed, so that you could be redeemed. He despised the shame of the cross, not the ones committing the crimes against him, but the shame that would be done to him. He loved the shamers enough to die for them. He despised the shame, thought this is not as important as dying for these people. Is that not amazing? Which takes us to the last thing he endured. Oh, last two things. Number 6. They stare at him. He's stripped, he's shamed, he's hanging on the cross, and it says they just watched him there. They gawked at him. Mouths slacked open, staring. I wonder what he's going to do. And when he didn't do anything for a moment, the last thing, they belittled him. Matthew 27:37-44. The Romans belittled him. They placed an accusation over his head. Here's the king of the Jews. Sounds like it's praise, but it's not. It's the same as putting a crown of thorns on his head. This is why we're killing Jesus. I want everybody to know official Roman history records that a man called Jesus from Nazareth was killed for the crime of being the king of the Jews. Well, that is actually accurate. That's why they killed him, because he was their king, and they rejected him. But the Romans put it there to belittle him. The chief priests belittled him. The chief priests saw him, and they said, no, don't write he's the king of the Jews. Write just that he said he's the king of the Jews. Give him this little bit of dignity, please. And here, instead they won't. Instead, here at the foot of the cross, they look up and they say, oh no, I don't want anybody to think that we think he's our king. Just say that he said it. He's just some nut who said he was the king. Not even that little shred of honor. But not there. Not just the Romans, not just the religious leaders, but even it says those that passed by belittled him, scoffing and mocking. I thought he was the Son of God. If he's the Son of God, why doesn't he come down? Why doesn't God deliver him? Oh, I guess he's not the Son of God. Just casual dismissiveness. But not just the leaders, not just the Romans, not just the common man, but even those crucified with him, who should have had enough on their minds, also mocked him. The same cast accusation and insult against him. Imagine enduring all of this and finding the actual guilty people joining in to attack you and still dying for them. Because he could have called 12 legions of angels, and he did not, because he loved everyone that he was dying for. We started this class in Galilee. We noticed 7 times Jesus talked about it. We went to Gethsemane. We noticed 7 things that Jesus thought about. We're now at GABBATHA, and we've seen 7 things that he endured. Next week, we start Golgotha. He goes up on the cross, and the silent Jesus, throughout all this class today, finally speaks. Last words for a person dies are in special words, important words. What are my master's last words? He has 7. We'll consider the first 3 next week. That's all I have for you. Thank you guys very much.